In 1862, a man named John Pierce was sentenced to 2 years in prison for stealing a loaf of bread. He did not serve those 2 years at hard labor. He served them on the treadmill, a wooden wheel 6 feet in diameter, turned by the weight of human bodies stepping on its paddles for 6 hours a day. The work produced nothing. It ground no grain. It powered no machinery. It existed purely to be exhausting, purely to be punishing, purely to communicate to the man walking it that the state considered his suffering to be justice. When he finished, John Pierce walked out of prison with no money, no employment, no housing, and a criminal record that made finding any of those things considerably harder than it had been before he went in. He was arrested for theft again within 6 weeks. Before we go further, if you're new here, this channel tells the hidden stories of the Victorian era, the ones buried beneath the respectable surface. Hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one. And if this video earns it, a like helps a small channel more than you know. Now, back to Victorian Britain and the prison system that thought suffering was the cure for crime. The Victorian prison system did not emerge from nowhere. It was built deliberately and self-consciously on a theory. The theory had a name. It was called the separate system, and it had, in its time, the enthusiastic support of some of the most progressive thinkers in Britain. The idea was this: crime was caused by moral corruption. Moral corruption was caused in part by association. Criminals contaminated each other, spreading bad habits, bad ideas, and bad company the way a disease spreads through contact. The solution, therefore, was to eliminate contact entirely, put each prisoner in a separate cell, allow no communication between prisoners, force each individual into solitary confrontation with his own conscience, his own crimes, and, ideally, with the religious instruction that the prison chaplain would provide. The separate system had been pioneered in America at the Eastern State Penitentiary in Philadelphia, and its British champions had visited it and returned convinced that they had seen the future of criminal justice. Among those champions was Charles Dickens, who visited the Eastern State Penitentiary in 1842 and wrote about it in his American Notes. What Dickens saw there horrified him. He had gone expecting to be impressed. What he found were men who had been in solitary confinement for years, who had lost the ability to hold normal conversations, who wept when spoken to, who could not maintain eye contact, who had developed the specific psychological deterioration that we now recognize as the consequence of prolonged isolation. Dickens wrote about it with his characteristic force. The separate system, he argued, was not rehabilitation. It was torture, conducted at a respectable remove by people who had convinced themselves that causing psychological damage was a form of moral improvement. His view did not immediately prevail. The separate system had powerful institutional momentum and powerful institutional champions. Pentonville Prison, which opened in London in 1842, the same year Dickens visited Philadelphia, was designed from the ground up as a showcase for the separate system. Its architecture was a direct expression of its theory, a panopticon-influenced design that placed cells in radiating wings from a central observation unit, allowing a single officer to survey multiple corridors simultaneously. The cells were identical, sparse, and separated from each other by thick walls designed to prevent any sound transmission between them. Prisoners at Pentonville wore masks when they left their cells, so they could not recognize each other in corridors or chapel. They sat in individual wooden boxes in the chapel, designed so that each prisoner could see the chaplain, but not his fellow inmates. They exercised in individual segments of the exercise yard, like slices of a pie, each prisoner moving in his designated section, unable to communicate with the person 2 feet away on the other side of a wooden partition. The Pentonville experiment ran for 5 years before the medical evidence became impossible to ignore. The rates of mental breakdown among prisoners subjected to the full separate system were extraordinary. Significant numbers of Pentonville inmates were being transferred to lunatic asylums. Others were developing conditions, visual disturbances, auditory hallucinations, what we would now call psychosis, that the prison authorities initially attributed to pre-existing mental weakness, but that occurred consistently enough and cleared up consistently enough after the isolation was relaxed to suggest a simpler explanation. The separate system was gradually modified, then quietly abandoned, then replaced, but not before it had produced years of documented psychological damage in the people subjected to it. What replaced it was not necessarily more humane. The silent system, in which prisoners were required to work alongside each other but were prohibited from communicating in any way, had been the alternative approach from the beginning, championed by those who believed that isolation was excessive, but that association remained dangerous. Under the silent system, prisoners worked in large halls, in proximity, in silence, enforced by officers whose entire professional purpose was to detect and punish any communication between inmates. Prisoners developed elaborate methods of covert communication, lip reading,
hand signals, tapped codes on walls and pipes, and the officers developed equally elaborate methods of detecting them. The prison became a surveillance environment of extraordinary intensity, where the energy of both staff and inmates was devoted substantially to this game of communication and counter-communication. The prison labor system of the Victorian era deserves its own examination because it represents one of the most philosophically confused aspects of Victorian penology. The Victorians could not decide what prison labor was for. Was it productive, generating economic value that offset the cost of imprisonment? Was it punitive, designed purely to be exhausting and unpleasant? Was it reformative, instilling work habits in people who were presumed not to have them? Different reformers gave different answers, and different prisons implemented different approaches. The result was a system that managed to be simultaneously economically irrational, physically brutal, and therapeutically useless. The treadmill was the purest expression of the punitive approach. Invented in 1818 by Sir William Cubitt, it was designed from the start to be unproductive. Cubitt's original proposal involved connecting it to machinery, but the connection was quickly dropped because the point was not the output, the point was the effort. Prisoners stepped on the paddles of the wheel, rising and falling as the wheel turned beneath them for fixed periods of time. The work served no purpose beyond the punishment it constituted. Medical officers documented the physical consequences with some care. The treadmill caused injuries to the knees and ankles, respiratory problems from the sustained exertion, and cumulative physical deterioration in prisoners subjected to it over extended periods. The medical documentation had essentially no effect on its use. The treadmill remained in British prisons until 1902. The crank was in some ways worse. A handle mounted in the prisoner's cell, connected to a drum filled with sand or gravel, required a set number of rotations per day to earn meals. The crank could be tightened by the officer, hence the origin of the word screw as prison slang for a guard, to make the required number of rotations more difficult to achieve. A prisoner who failed to complete his required rotations did not eat. The Birmingham prison scandal of 1853 exposed what this system produced at its worst. The governor of Birmingham prison, a man named Austin, had been systematically tightening the cranks in his institution to a degree that made the required rotations nearly impossible. Prisoners, including children, because Victorian prisons at this time housed juveniles alongside adults, were being starved as a consequence of their inability to complete what the governor had made, in effect, an impossible task. One prisoner, a 15-year-old boy named Edward Andrews, hanged himself in his cell after being unable to complete his crank rotations and facing starvation. The subsequent inquiry led to Austin's removal and to a parliamentary investigation into prison conditions nationally. The Prison Act of 1865 introduced somewhat more consistent standards across the prison system.
The Prison Act of 1877 nationalized the entire prison estate, bringing all local and county prisons under central government control for the first time. The person who did the most to reform the Victorian prison system was not a politician or a reformer, but a prisoner. Oscar Wilde spent 2 years in Reading Gaol from 1895 to 1897, convicted of gross indecency. His experiences there, the separate system in its declining but still operational form, the silence, the labor, the isolation, the diet, are described in extraordinary detail in De Profundis, the long letter he wrote from prison, and in The Ballad of Reading Gaol, the poem he published after his release. Wilde had access to an audience and a vocabulary that most Victorian prisoners did not. He could describe what prison did to a human being in language that people read and remembered. His account of the psychological deterioration produced by isolation, the voices in the dark, the loss of the sense of time, the specific texture of institutional cruelty, was more powerful as testimony than 100 parliamentary reports. Yet Wilde's reform of the prison system also has a limit that is worth acknowledging. His advocacy was primarily for prisoners of his own class and sensibility, educated men brought low by the system's cruelty. The 15-year-old boy who hanged himself in Birmingham prison
in 1853 had no poet to describe his death. He appears in the historical record as a number in a parliamentary inquiry. His name was Edward Andrews. He was 15 years old. He was in prison for something that the inquiry report does not clearly specify. The Victorian prison system produced both John Pierce, the man who stole bread and emerged more criminal than he entered, and Edward Andrews, who did not emerge at all. It produced Oscar Wilde, who emerged with his genius intact, but his health and his reputation destroyed, and who died 3 years after his release. What it did not produce, by any reliable measure, was rehabilitation. The recidivism rates of the Victorian prison system, the proportion of released prisoners who were reconvicted, were documented extensively and were consistently high. The system knew this. The parliamentary committees that reviewed it knew it. The prison reformers knew it. The Victorian prison continued anyway, because it was not primarily designed to prevent future crime. It was designed to punish present crime. And suffering in Victorian criminal justice was considered its own justification, regardless of whether it produced any outcome that anyone could describe as beneficial. The treadmill was finally abolished in 1902. The crank had gone somewhat earlier. Solitary confinement in the full separate system gradually gave way to more moderate isolation regimes. Prison labor was increasingly connected to useful production, workshops, farming, mailbag sewing. But the fundamental architecture of the Victorian prison, the cell, the wing, the central control point, the surveillance of every movement, that architecture persisted. If you have ever seen the inside of a Victorian-era prison, or a prison built on the Victorian model, you have seen a building that expresses, in its physical structure, a theory of human nature, that people are improved by isolation, surveillance, and suffering. The evidence for that theory has never been particularly strong. If the hidden histories of crime and justice matter to you, subscribe. Every week, we find the stories that the surface does not show. Next week, the Victorian Mental Asylum, the institution where inconvenient people were made to disappear, and the women who were committed simply for disagreeing with their husbands. See you then.